World Affairs Roundup, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage, Assistant Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM, with a New Year's edition of our World Affairs Roundup. The financial meltdown and debate over health care dominated the Obama administration's agenda last year. But the world continued to turn, and 2010 promises to deliver new items into the foreign policy inbox. Today we'll be looking at a few perennial issues likely to take some interesting turns in the months ahead, including 10 plus 10. As midterm elections loom, a 10% U.S. unemployment rate, contrasted with a 10% growth rate for the Chinese economy, could make Beijing bashing a popular play on Main Street. As China flexes its muscles, will relations with the U.S. go from sweet to sour? Islamabad to worse. Facing simultaneous political, economic, and security crises, Pakistan begins the new year in a precarious position. The U.S. has a clear interest in stabilizing the situation, but does it have the means? Tough times for Tehran. Pressed by a persistent and growing opposition movement, suffering setbacks among its regional proxies, and facing calls for tougher international sanctions, Iran's hardliners aren't beginning 2010 in a mood for compromise. How should Obama recalibrate his approach? To help us explore these stories and more, we're joined by John Katzka, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who has conducted public diplomacy for the Department of State on 4 continents. Frederick Kessler, Wisconsin State Representative representing the 12th Assembly District. He also works as a political consultant in the U.S. and abroad and has served as a circuit court judge. And Robert Kraig, author of a number of articles and books dealing with the history and politics of American foreign policy. He currently serves as Executive Director of Citizen Action of Wisconsin. Well, welcome and Happy New Year to everyone.
Thank you, and to our viewers.
Absolutely. Well, I would like to start with China. Robert, maybe you could just give us a brief background of the relationship. What do both sides look for and get out of the relationship on the positive side?
Well, I mean, I think probably the most popular prognostication for the new year is that the U.S. and China will get into much more serious conflict. There's an expectation that it will become kind of a G2, much more of a bipolar world, with those being the two dominant economies, but having a conflict of interest, a conflict of political cultures, etc. And of course, part of the issue is not only a lot of differences across the whole spectrum of foreign policy issues, ranging from Iran to North Korea, but the complicated economic relationship between China and the United States, where China, with a mercantilist almost foreign policy, economic policy, has built up a very large economy based in large part on exports to the U.S. market, but has financed U.S. debt in the process. And we have a situation where China is very much ascendant, even though it has huge economic inequalities and still has 800 million very poor peasants who are not part of the new economy. But the United States and the rest of the Western world, certainly, and most of the world's had a huge financial collapse the last 2 years, but the U.S. is seen as not ascending anymore as a power, not as it was in the 19th and early 20th century. China is seen as more the ascendant power, and China feeling its oats a lot more, making the kind of statements and taking actions in international conferences that suggest its increased ethos and sense of itself. And so even though the Obama administration has worked very hard to try to develop a relationship with China, it's still not worked out entirely. China was not very helpful at all in the Copenhagen negotiations over global warming, and China may become a huge political issue in the elections, because as you pointed out, Doug, we have 10% unemployment in the United States, but 10% growth rate in China, and a sense that every good you pick up on the shelves is made in China, but that their markets are not open to the United States. And so the situation is very precarious. Whether China will become a major political issue in the elections or not in the United States remains to be seen, but it certainly could.
Well, Fred, on the plus side of the ledger, what is it the administration would like to get out of the relationship?
Well, I think they certainly love to see a decrease in the number of imports coming into the United States. But I think this is clearly going to be a political issue. I cannot see how it isn't got a populist appeal, specifically in industrial, the Midwest and the East, and probably on the coast it's not as significant an issue. But so long as we have unemployment and we are seeing companies transferring plants, I mean, it used to be they'd go to Mississippi and then they went to Mexico, and now they're going to China. And I think that that's a pretty sexy political issue that people can use.
John, what are the sort of most proximate sources of tension we're likely to see in the coming months?
Well, let's look at a couple of the issues that we face with them. And North Korea is probably at the top of the list. We have expectations coming out of the North Korean issue that focus totally on the nuclear non-proliferation issue, where China looks at this from a slightly different perspective. They see this more in terms of the stability of the regime. Their concerns are much higher that a collapse of the North Korean regime would bring refugees across the border and present them with enormous problems. So part of the problem we're going to have with China is our differing perspectives on these things. We have, I think, too much of a laundry list of issues that we bring to the table with them, including the human rights issues, including a number of their relations with other countries. We need to prioritize this list, and this administration needs to establish what are the most important points that we want to establish in a relationship with China.
John, let me add just a question. What do you see as the impact, for instance, of now our willing to sell more military equipment to Taiwan? And is this just a poise where we're posturing, or is there something more serious involved?
Well, it's a serious issue, and the Chinese will see it as a serious issue, and we're playing, I suspect, more to domestic constituencies than we are to the international ramifications of this. Taiwan, that was another time. It is no longer part of how we're going to define our interest in that part of the world. There are enough people in this country still who are connected to that relationship and will support it. So it is an issue, and the Chinese will see it as an issue as they see our relation to the fact that the president is going to see the Dalai Lama. They will see that as another stumbling block. All of these things need to be put into perspective. Where's the priorities? What do we need from our relationship with the Chinese? Is seeing the Dalai Lama more important than working out a relationship about the balance of payments relationships?
Well, and what about the looming midterm elections? I mean, how big a factor does domestic U.S. politics play in the sort of rising prominence put on the economic relationship?
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, the economic situation is going to dominate the elections, quite clearly, even more so than what happens with the healthcare debate, because unemployment is not going down at all. And in fact, and you know, there wasn't really enough done with stimulus. The Chinese actually did a much more extensive stimulus package than we did, as it turned out, and actually financed with government money their growth. And so, obviously, with what Fred pointed out before, the tangible transfer of American jobs to China, quite frankly, with strong support from the American business community and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, that becomes a major electoral issue by definition. It's something more tangible than the complexities of, say, finance reform. A lot of the economic collapse is too complicated to become a political issue. Obviously, attacking Wall Street is a political issue, and the big banks. But in general, China is something that is tangible as a narrative. It's someone who is taking jobs in the United States, someone who is manipulating currency, arguably, in order to make their exports cheaper and make our imports more expensive. And also, quite frankly, there's an element of xenophobia about it. It's easy to blame foreigners for things, as we see over and over again. So I think Fred's right. It's hard to see how it doesn't become a major political issue.
So two of us have stole your thunder.
Well, let's move a bit further west. John, maybe you could talk a little bit about the situation in Pakistan.
Yes. Well, if you talk about Pakistan, you're also going to have to talk about Afghanistan, because what we do in each of these places affects how whatever is going to turn out in the other. We're also caught up with a romantic, well, that's not the right word, a comfortable definition of what the reality is like in Pakistan. We are much more comfortable dealing with Islamabadic, if that's the right word for people who live in Islamabad, elites than we are with the nomads and the tribal people who populate the Northwest Territories.
Well, that brings up a question. The current government is under a certain amount of political pressure right now based on some former corruption charges and things. Is this significant, or are those players really not the movers and shakers we need to be concerned with?
When you talk about corruption charges in the third world, we're talking about some sort of Western mechanism that has no reality. You get to the third world and they scratch your head. They scratch their heads when we start talking about corruption. Corruption is short-term advantage. It is how I take care of myself right now and I take care of my family.
So if we see Zardari depart the scene, is that significant for U.S. interests in the region or not?
I think it's destabilizing to a degree, but it is not as critical as if there was a major shakeup in the army.
Mm-hmm.
I think I want to agree with you there. I think that when you look historically at what has been the major power source in Pakistan, despite the unseating of Bhutto years and years ago and the various displacements of elected prime ministers and presidents, the army has always been sort of the role as the independent power player there. And I suspect that there may be a strong relationship between the U.S. defense establishment and the military in Pakistan that may be almost as significant as the relationship between the presidents and here and prime ministers and presidents there.
I think you're underselling the military relationship. I think it's much stronger than it is between the politicians.
So, Robert, based on what we've seen, is 2010 likely to require any major recalibration on the part of the administration here?
In terms of Pakistan?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, we have a situation where you could have a failed state, to be quite frank. It's a very fragile civil society. I do think that creating a stronger civil society in Pakistan is crucial, and that there are a lot of elements in the military that still see their major enemy as India and want to foment, and we could have huge instability if we had terrorist attacks that took place in India and Pakistan and India became engaged. You have two nuclear powers. Very unclear, therefore, whether Zardari's administration can, while trying to take a pro-American line in regard to attacking at least terrorists or insurgents in some areas of the country and not in others, can maintain popularity and build a strong civil society, because it's publicly very unpopular. Obviously, the drone missile attacks are extremely unpopular. And so it's an extremely precarious situation. It's connected to the whole Afghan policy, where we're going to have over 100,000 troops soon enough with the surge strategy, and so I think there's going to have to be a lot of recalibration. I'm not sure, given that we have a realistic strategy in terms of Pakistan, though, at all.
Well, we're going to have to leave Islamabad and head off to Tehran after our break. We'll be back in just a few minutes with more International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus and our World Affairs Roundup. John, just before the break, you had another point you wanted to raise?
I do, on Pakistan. I think it's very important that people realize that the area that is crucial in terms of of our relations, of what we're doing in Afghanistan, the Northwest Territories, is a part of Pakistan that the Pakistani army or the politicians have never controlled. There is a loose tribal, almost colonial relationship to that particular area on the part of Pakistan, and that the intelligence service of the Pakistani army was able to use it to a degree by appealing to the most fundamentalist connections in there. And so therefore, everything that we're trying to do in terms of controlling that area or putting the pressure on them destabilizes the regime in Islamabad, as well as puts pressure on the military that they have never been able to deliver on before. So it's a very important problem for us. And when we try to have so many different agenda items, like civil society for Pakistan, as well as a whole number of things, all of these things begin to make the problem much more complex, and we have to prioritize them.
Well, another complex set of issues are found in Tehran. Fred, maybe you could give us a little sense of where you think the opposition movement is right now.
Well, I think the opposition movement is in pretty strong shape, but I think the real problem that we have to face in this country is to what extent do we articulate some degree of support and concern for the opposition movement, and can we become demonized as the source of support for that, and what would be the impact of that? I think it's absolutely crucial that the Obama administration move with great caution here, because I think if we fail to do so, we may end up strengthening the regime, and that scares me a little bit, because I think there is a degree of momentum. I haven't yet, as I watch, seen the switches of some of the law enforcement powers to the other side, but I suspect that's going to happen with sort of massive responses to demonstrations.
Well, and Robert, what about sort of the campaign promise to reach out to Tehran, and just sort of the initial attempts at rapprochement? Does that have to be rejiggered at this point, based on what's happened in the last several months?
Well, the administration's tried to do that, which I think I agree with, and I think it's a laudable thing to do, and I don't think it should be abandoned at this point. It takes a long time to have engagement. Now, they did not predict, this election fiasco where the election was quite clearly stolen for Ahmadinejad, and the supreme leader has delegitimized himself not only with the global opinion but with his own public, and has split the leadership of the theocracy, quite frankly. And so that makes it much more complicated. You have a supreme leader and a prime minister who are trying to capitalize on any anti-American feeling they can in order to maintain control, and using their nuclear options as a way to do that as well. And so it makes the situation extremely complicated. I think we have to start to move towards, and we don't want to call it this because they'll use this, towards a somewhat more forceful stance on very targeted sanctions that are very specific and will definitely sunset if we get the kind of behavior we want on the nuclear situation. But we need to be very careful. This is what Fred was referring to, not to be seen as supporting the opposition, because that would be it's sort of the equivalent of being connected to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. If anyone's connected to the United States in Iranian politics, it's the third rail of Iranian politics. And so we cannot be seen as trying to get regime change, as supporting the opposition, we actually can't make it. I think this points to John's points on a couple of different issues. Our top priority to get regime change. Our top priority now is to try to get Iran backed off of their nuclear proliferation, and try to gradually engage them in helping with other regional issues, especially around Afghanistan, where they can play a huge role in helping get a regional settlement in Afghanistan.
Well, John, let's talk a little bit about sanctions. What is the state of the Iranian economy, and is that a stick we're likely to use effectively?
Well, sanctions generally are rarely effective in terms of how they're delivered. I mean, there are very few instances, South Africa being one case in point and Rhodesia another, but in most cases sanctions are more to feel good about the issue than it is to really affect anything. there is no way that we are going to get sanctions through the Security Council. China and Russia, for a variety of reasons, mostly to do with national interference in internal affairs of sovereign states, but also because China has an increasingly robust economic relationship with Tehran, are unlikely to be willing to support that. Our own allies, likely, are not going to be enthusiastic about any hard measures that we're going to apply against them. So, and there will probably be backsliding even if they agree to them. So the idea that we're going to get support on the sanctions issue is limited. I'm also concerned that the idea of nuclear nonproliferation it may have been passed by. Our idea that we are going to be able to tell Tehran, that is a major player in their part of the world, that they cannot have a nuclear weapon when Israel, India, and Pakistan have them already. I just find it very difficult to believe we're going to be able to sustain that in the long term.
So here's a simple yes or no question. Are we going to see and have to live with a nuclear Iran? What do you think?
I hope not, but I think John may be right.
I'm inclined to think that John is right. I think that's just a balance of power issue, and they are going to be wanting to insist on having that power, potentially as a deterrent, but having that power because the people who they perceive as their enemies already have the bomb.
Let me make a comment also on the presidential engaging issue, because I think this is a very good example where the campaign rhetoric gets out ahead of you. We have had contacts with the Iranians for a number of years. I've said it on this program a number of times. You don't get the president involved in resolving these issues until you are close to signing something. So it's a question of what level can you get things done. Well, we're finding out with Iran, it is very difficult to get them to a point where we can sign something, that we can agree on something. So getting the president involved is not the point. It is not the time for it.
Well, we've got a few minutes left, and as we mentioned in the beginning, these are some perennials we'll watch, but there's also other issues that may be just over the horizon. So I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to point to some other stories we should be watching. John, what did you say?
Well, I'm going to go back to some of my old stomping grounds. Let's go to Russia. I think Russia is going to be very interesting in the period ahead on three different fronts. One, Putin has decided to back his technocratic president and parts of the regime to reform some of the structures and take away power from some of these Siloviki, as they're called, the power that came out of the KGB, and do some reforms there. Internationally, they are likely to be expanding their reach into the former Soviet Union. They have already signed a customs agreement with Kazakhstan and Belarus, and all of the leading presidential candidates in Ukraine for president are pro-Russia.
Fred?
Well, I think that we have to look at southern Sudan. You know that there is a referendum that's supposed to take place on either a degree of independence or autonomy, at least for the southern Sudan. But in the southern Sudan, that's where the oil is located, and currently China has got the big share of that. Several days ago, maybe even yesterday, there was a story that appeared about 2,500 people being killed in tribal warfare in the south. I believe that Khartoum is encouraging those tribal warfare, or the tribal warfare. I think Khartoum does not want that referendum to go ahead because if it prevails in the south, Khartoum risks losing a large part of the oil revenue and therefore its political clout. And so I think we should watch very carefully on tribalism in southern Sudan and whether the referendum will actually go ahead.
Robert?
I think we have to think about the aftermath of Copenhagen, and I think that overall it has to be described as very disappointing how things went there. We are not anywhere near any kind of binding international agreement on CO2, and it will cause devastating consequences within the next, it could be even the last 20 years, let alone the next 50 years. And so this it's going to define this century if we cannot do something about this. And in fact, even the tentative agreement that was reached would permit an increase in CO2 to a level that will doom Africa to famine and mass dislocation. And so the whole south of the globe would be in peril even if we were to reach those goals, which we're nowhere near reaching just because of these negotiations. China was not helpful in these negotiations. So this is something that overshadows everything else, the fact that we are, as a world, not anywhere near coming to grips with this threat, quite frankly, to advanced industrial civilization.
So where would you lay the blame for the failure to come to a meaningful accord in Copenhagen?
Well, it's a whole question of whether or not nation states or individual leaders or political leaders are able to deal with short-term pain and to deal with some long-term problem. It's an age-old question. Political systems aren't very good at dealing with this, and you can see in the United States it's almost impossible to deal with cap and trade even, which is very minimal because you'll have the coal-producing states and opposing it, and various energy interests opposing it, which are very well entrenched in the United States and across the globe. So it really is a special interest, short-term versus the common good, even though there's a really common good case to be made for major investments actually improving the whole global economy if we were to make them.
Well, I'll have to cut you off there to our viewers. I look forward to a year in which your common good is well taken care of, and we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,